Okay. All right. So this was the last slide from Thursday. All right. So like I said, I'm combining chapters 3 and 4 into one test. So chapter 4 is the first two sections is mainly dealing with the amendments to the Constitution. All right. And the Constitution test itself is kind of heavy on amendments. And unfortunately, it's just kind of a lot of memorization on like what the Second Amendment is, what the 13th Amendment is, stuff like that. It's just kind of like just trying. And again, you've probably had this like last time in junior high, so it shouldn't be too far from your memory bank, if you will. Right. So on Thursday, introducing chapter 4, we were talking about the Bill of Rights, right? Which the Bill of Rights are what's the definition of the Bill of Rights? Like an easy definition. Basically, it's the first how many amendments of the Constitution? 10, right? And remember, an amendment is basically a change. When you amend something, you change something. So on Thursday, we were mainly dealing with the First Amendment, which there's a number of freedoms that are listed in that First Amendment. All right, like the last one here, freedom of petition. So this is the idea that you can basically kind of like, petition the government and ask the government for certain changes or addressing certain grievances and stuff like that. What's another freedom that was in the First Amendment?
Religion.
Boom, freedom of religion, right? Speech, press.
Right to gather or something.
Yeah, assembly. So like, protests or stuff like that. So those are all basically kind of listed within that First Amendment. And so the First Amendment, and again, we were kind of talking a little bit about certain things in the sense that there is, while you have freedoms, rights do come with some responsibilities. Like I was saying, like with freedom of speech, I couldn't just like yell, just like fire if there was no fire. And like they use a movie theater analogy, but in crowded, like school or whatever like that, because my speech could, by basically saying, hey, there's a fire, everybody kind of like leave, somebody could get hurt in the kind of the process of trying to leave. All right. Or if my speech, like I said, I could be very critical of the president of the United States, but if my speech advocates for essentially kind of like violent overthrow of the government, then my speech has kind of crossed the line. So with that, there's certain rights and responsibilities, right? So this is going to finish up this first section here. We're going to knock out the amendments, second amendment through the 10th Amendment, and just real kind of short, kind of like little like kind of clip notes, if you will. So let's see. We'll go on. Second Amendment is a pretty famous amendment that a lot of people like to cite, and sometimes I think some of these amendments, and we like in the videos that we watched last week, we kind of talking about a lot of times the courts, the Supreme Court generally kind of determines whether certain laws match up with the Constitution. All right. So the Second Amendment is the right to bear arms, basically own guns, right? This is something that's pretty divisive in this country in certain cases, right? There are certain people that believe that, and again, it's how you read the amendment too. There's certain people interpret, because within the Second Amendment, it says a kind of a well-established militia, right, is kind of essential to the freedoms and such. Some people who read that see a militia as individuals, right? And so that basically gives every individual kind of the right to own a gun. Other people see that as, does that mean National Guard, state militia, and such? And even with this amendment, there have been states and such that have put certain limitations. And there's a number of groups like the National Rifle Association, which is opposed to things like background checks and such. The idea of someone that has to like wait a certain amount of time before they can own a gun. All right. This is the Second Amendment it's what we call kind of a political football. All right. It's been used on both sides to essentially kind of gather support. Right. There's a number of people that on the right that kind of use it to basically kind of like say the idea the government's going to take your guns away. And then on the left, the idea that there should be some serious limitations on things like AR-15s or such. All right. The founding fathers, the deal is with this, with the Constitution, is this was written in the 18th century. I don't think the founding fathers had anticipated the use of automatic weapons. Back then, they were kind of using muskets and stuff. All right. But again, this is something that a lot of times courts and states kind of determine how the kind of certain kind of regulations fit into that Second Amendment. Third Amendment, one that's not usually kind of controversial, no quartering your troops. What do you mean by quartering? You guys remember? Yeah, housing. Yeah. So basically, this is a reaction that kind of like came out after the French and Indian War, right? Because after the French and Indian War, the colonists felt that, the British government could allow British troops to stay with people, like live within their homes, All right, so this amendment is a direct reaction to essentially what had been, it was contemporary at its time. Today, this isn't real. It's on the books, but it's really not necessarily something that you hear people talking about. All right, this one is definitely a little bit more of a kind of relation to kind of what went on in French and Indian War and after the American Revolution. The Fourth Amendment protects against unreasonable search and seizures. This is a pretty significant amendment here. All right, and again, this is kind of the reaction to certain kind of policies that the British government had in place after the French and Indian War. All right, and so this is this idea how like with these kind of amendments to the Bill of Rights here, how individuals, like specific individuals, how they are protected under the law. All right, so I'm gonna play this video here. Kind of does a little like the little crash course thing here. We'll talk about certain things when it comes to warrants and stuff like that. All right, and those have been in the news recently. Kind of the no-knock warrants thing. All right, so let me click this here. We're gonna watch this ad first. No, we skip it.
Hi, I'm Craig, and this is Crash Course Government and Politics, and today we're going to continue our discussion of the Bill of Rights and talk about something that may actually be useful to you. We're going to talk about when the police are allowed to search your house, your car, and even you. But not me. I have immunity. I'm on YouTube. Right? Is that how it works, Dan? It's not how it works? I'm in trouble. You might think that this only matters if you are, a criminal, and if you are, then you should be paying close attention. But even if you haven't committed any crimes and you are unlucky enough to be stopped by the police, these protections apply. The question of when and where and how the police can conduct a search falls under the general topic of criminal procedure. In this case, the second word is important. The courts usually look at how the police are acting, and the protections courts have supported are primarily procedural. What this means is that there is no unlimited, sometimes called substantive, right to have the police not search you or your home. The criminal procedure civil liberties are found in the 4th, 5th, and 6th Amendments, but today we're only going to look at the 4th Amendment, which reads, "The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrants shall issue but upon probable cause, supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized." You can see right away that this is not an absolute right. The framers made sure that we are only protected from unreasonable searches and seizures, and they added that the police are supposed to get a warrant before they search you. Let's start with a warrant requirement because it's kind of confusing. A search warrant is a piece of paper issued by a judge authorizing law enforcement officers to search something, usually your house, but possibly your car or your person. Or your desk eagle. I'm not hiding anything in there. But according to the 4th Amendment, for the police to get a judge to issue a warrant, they must have probable cause, which is more than just a suspicion or an anonymous tip. Although sometimes judges will issue warrants on pretty flimsy probable cause. When they are issued, warrants are supposed to be specific, laying out what the police are searching for and where they expect to find it. This means that if the warrant says the police can search your garage for a stolen car, they can't look in your kitchen drawers and cupboards because A, the warrant says they can search your garage, and B, they're looking for a car, and you can't hide a car in your kitchen drawers unless it's a very small car. I drive a Prius, which is pretty small, but it doesn't fit in my kitchen drawers. I've tried. Even when I take the whisk out. You'll notice that I qualified my statement about warrants. You do this a lot when you're talking about criminal procedure. I said when they are issued. Despite the fact that the 4th Amendment seems to say that the police always need a warrant, the courts have ruled that it is not always required for the police to engage in a reasonable search. What this means is that if the police have probable cause to search you, say they catch you pocketing powdered donuts in the grocery store, they don't always need to go to the judge to search you. What makes a reasonable search is a question that the courts have wrestled with. Sometimes, like with a stolen car in the kitchen cabinet, it's pretty obvious, but many times it isn't. For example, if the warrant allows the police to search your kitchen for illegal hand grenades and they look in your freezer and find illegal drugs instead, that's probably reasonable because freezers are where most people store their illegal hand grenades. And also their drugs. And if the police stop you for speeding, which is a violation of traffic laws, also known as a crime, and then search your car and find a dead body in the trunk, the courts have ruled that this is reasonable too. It's important to realize that the warrant and reasonableness requirements are not meant to prevent the police from stopping criminals caught in the act. If the police, after chasing a masked man carrying a bag with a dollar sign on it, running away from a bank that has just been reported robbed by a man with a gun and a mask, manage to catch him, they don't need an arrest warrant to take him into custody. And because the running away and the bag of money are pretty suggestive, the police will have probable cause to search the guy, who in my mind looks like the Hamburglar, for the gun. And the question is, can they use the gun as evidence? Let's go to the thought bubble. One of the most important important Supreme Court cases dealing with searches and seizures is Mapp versus Ohio, decided in 1961. The facts of the case are pretty wild. The police went to the home of Dalree Mapp to search for explosives and gambling equipment. They didn't have a warrant, so she didn't let them in. They came back a bit later with a fake warrant and searched the house. They didn't find explosives or gambling equipment, but they did find a trunk full of pornography, which was illegal at the time, so they arrested her. The main evidence against her, naturally, was the pornography, but the cops' probable cause was to search for explosives. The court ruled that the evidence had been seized through an illegal search. There was no warrant, and even if there had been one, it probably wouldn't have included the trunk in which they found the porn. More important, they ruled that this and any evidence seized pursuant to an illegal search cannot be used against the defendant in a trial. This is called an exclusionary rule. Unlawfully obtained evidence is excluded from the trial, and it's sometimes called the fruit of the poison tree, possibly because lawyers are better at naming things than historians are. This is incredibly important, especially for cop shows on TV, but also for you if you happen to have your home searched illegally and the police find evidence of criminal activity. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So it seems like there are some pretty strong protections against the police searching your home because of Mapp. But there are also plenty of exceptions, and no, we're not talking about the Mongols. Many of these exceptions involve your car. In general, the courts have been very lenient when police search your car, probably because very often when they pull you over, it's because of some kind of moving violation, like speeding, which can be probable cause, especially if they think you might be speeding away from a crime. The court decisions on this issue are really, really complicated, but the general rule of thumb is that the police can usually search your car, and you, if they pull you over, despite what Jay-Z may think. Another question that comes up is random traffic stops to check for drunk driving. A breathalyzer is a type of search, so it would seem that the police should have probable cause to stop you and check to see if you're drunk. But the courts have ruled that drunk driving checkpoints are okay, assuming they don't disproportionately target people of a specific race. But that's for another episode. While we're talking about cars and specific groups of people, I should probably add that there's one group of people who don't have the same protections against searches. Students. Students often think that it's not okay for school officials to search their lockers or their book bags, but those students are wrong. Most students go to public schools where the officials are mostly government workers and are subject to the Bill of Rights. The courts have ruled that students don't have the same protections as other citizens, and that the interests of the state in keeping a safe, drug, and weapon-free educational environment trumps their privacy interests. Although there are limits to how intrusive these searches can be. Drug tests for student athletes? Fine. Strip searches? Not okay. In BT dubs, in the same way that a breathalyzer test is a search, so is a drug test, or as they say in England, a drugs test, which is probably a more accurate way to say it because they usually test more than one drug. These can seem pretty intrusive, but the courts usually rule that they are okay, especially where public safety is concerned. The state interest in drug-free schools is a pretty strong one, but the cases on student drug tests are really interesting, especially when they get into the issue of whether schools can test all students without probable cause, or only specific groups like athletes. If you're really interested, you should look these cases up. But why are you so interested? Maybe you should take a drug test. Or a drugs test. So I'm going to stop here before I get too deep in the weeds about search and seizures and the Fourth Amendment. There are two important things to remember. The first is that, like all the constitutional protections of civil liberties, it only applies to government agents. You have no Fourth Amendment protection against your parents searching your room, unless your parents are police officers and they're on duty, and it's like official police business. The second thing to remember is that the protections in the Fourth Amendment are far from absolute. The amendment itself includes a reasonableness standard, and what is reasonable, as well as when warrants are necessary, has been and continues to be determined by the courts. In this case, as with most civil liberties cases, the courts attempt to balance an individual's interest in maintaining her privacy against the state's interest in preventing crime and keeping citizens safe. It's not an easy balance, but that's what makes the issue complex and interesting, at least to us here at Crash Course, because we're complex and interesting. Right, Stan? Thanks for watching. See you next time. Crash Course Government and Politics is produced in association with PBS Digital Studios. Support for Crash Course U.S. Government comes from Vocal.
All right, so like it was mentioned in the Fourth Amendment, one of the things that is listed in there, this idea that if your home or car, in this case, but the founding fathers weren't anticipating vehicles like that, to make sure that, hello?
I'm here.
Yes,
Thank you.
thank you. To make sure that your what is being searched and ultimately seized is on the legal up and up. There has to be a search warrant. It must state specifically the place that is being searched, what is exactly being searched for. Like I said, that was kind of established. Well, it's in the Constitution. The kind of certain cases brought in front of the Supreme Court, like Mapp versus Ohio, kind of solidify that idea. Like so, in that case, they didn't find the kind of gambling, kind of like they're looking for kind of gambling evidence. They instead found pornography, which at the time was illegal. So they determined that that was not on the warrant, and therefore that it was not admissible in court. All right. So, like the video said, cars though are a different matter. The whole idea, there's a little bit of kind of like vagueness to that. The idea of a reasonable kind of like suspicion and such allow, to a certain extent allows for the police to kind of search your vehicle. All right. So some of this stuff is we've kind of like laid out in court cases many times. The Fifth Amendment is a kind of a catch-all, one of these catch-all amendments. All right. What it says that provides for due process of law. And we'll talk about what exactly that is. Protection against self-incrimination. Do you ever watch any like TV shows where somebody on the stand says they plead the Fifth? That's from the Fifth Amendment. Basically, you don't have to basically incriminate yourself. And the right to a grand jury in criminal cases. We'll talk about what a grand jury here is. Yo.
I thought the Fifth Amendment was like double jeopardy to where
It's coming. We're talking about it. It says the catch-all. There's gonna be stuff up in there. Like I said, the Fifth Amendment, they kind of have a lot of like things to kind of unpack in there. All right. So there's a few terms that you'll see kind of on the test, like to formally accuse somebody of a crime within the Fifth Amendment. It's an indictment or to indict. Right. The indictment has to list a specific kind of crime. All right. And then the concept, like I said, there were like basically a grand jury for criminal cases. Before a criminal case could go to what we call a petit jury, right? It has to go through a grand jury who determines if there's enough evidence for a trial. All right. And so a lot of times grand juries will determine if the evidence there can be allowed in court. All right. So within here, you're basically given exactly what you're being accused of, right? And the idea that like this kind of the evidence that's going to be used in court can be determined by a grand jury, right? And then here's what you were talking about, the whole idea basically like when they say plead the Fifth, basically you kind of like you got protection against your self-incrimination, testifying against oneself. All right, that should not, particularly with the jury, that should not matter in that case because it is a constitutional right. And then like Cohen was talking about this concept of double jeopardy. You can't be tried for the same crime twice, right? Now the specific crime if you, right? And so there's, it's like, yeah, I'm popular there. Hey, how's it going?
Kathy was wondering if you could take care of that.
Got it. Tell her yes. Thank you. So, but let's say, if it's stealing, right? Let's say I got caught stealing from Target, and they determined that I was not guilty, right? That doesn't mean I could go to like Walmart and go steal, right? I can still be tried for that. It's the same very exact crime, right? So that's the big thing. That's probably one of the more famous kind of stipulations within the Fifth Amendment. There is a concept of double jeopardy. But due process of law is this kind of catch-all term that the Fifth Amendment is essentially kind of exemplifies. Is the idea of you're given basically fair treatment through the judicial system. No person can be denied life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Right? So you have to give everybody is supposed to have under the legal system the same amount of rights. So if you ever see like there's the kind of like the court system where justice is blind, right? Where you have this kind of a blindfolded woman holding scales there, the Lady Justice, if you will, right? That idea is that within our court system, like basically the evidence at hand is what matters, right? But there's other factors like, wealth, obviously. If you are pretty wealthy, you can have a pretty good defense attorney, right? And attorneys do a good job at basically kind of working their way around certain things within the system here, all right? So with this idea, you're supposed to have basically kind of a right to a jury, right to basically kind of certain things that protect you from the government kind of basically just arresting you without much cause, all right? So that's kind of what the Fifth Amendment is basically kind of covering. Another thing that's kind of unpacked under the Fifth Amendment is the idea of eminent domain. This is when it comes to private property. So the government just can't take your home. Dear Lord. Hey.
Hey, I have a Kahoot's question for you.
Yeah.
Kahoot's expert. If I put it on my Google Classroom, does it only let 100 kids play the game?
Oh, I don't know. I mean, if you, I put it on Google, I mean, I put it in each individual class.
The kids probably won't play it anyway, so I won't have to worry about
Yeah,
it.
you just go to the Google thing, you just put it in there in each individual class. And it goes to my Google Classroom.
Yeah, but I know in last year, like after 100 kids played it, one let me know kids play. I have 176 kids.
I've never had it. When did, yeah. I guess I never had 100 kids play it. So, yeah, that might be my problem. So, the idea of eminent domain, let's say that let's say they need your house, they want to take your house to have a highway kind of built through that area. All right, that's probably the most kind of classic sense of eminent domain. They're supposed to pay you fair market price for that home. They just can't basically take it from you. All right. So a lot of times eminent domain cases are in places where you have kind of expansion of, let's say, airports, highways and stuff like that. In certain cases, the government could get around certain ways. I mean, because there's certain people that will not want to move, and then kind of governments can give looks to the courts to kind of force that person to kind of essentially kind of give up their home if need be. All right, but the idea within the Fifth Amendment is that the government just can't come in, sweep in, and go, we're taking your home, that you get nothing for it. All right, so that's under the Fifth Amendment as well. Sixth Amendment, and we'll talk about the Sixth Amendment when we get into the kind of judicial system a little bit more. This kind of guarantees the right to a fair and prompt trial by jury. Usually when we're talking about kind of in criminal cases, you must be informed of the charges and a right to hear question of all witnesses that are accusing you of whatever you're being accused of. All right. This is an important amendment that was kind of again kind of reaction to certain events that occurred during the time of British rule. Right. And so within the Sixth Amendment, we'll talk about that a little bit more later. We'll talk about it. And then the Seventh Amendment, this is basically trial by jury when it comes to what we call civil cases, anything that involves money or property. All right, criminal, the Sixth Amendment protects with criminal cases. Seventh Amendment, anything if you're being sued, all right, you have to a certain, like if it's a certain monetary amount, all right, over a certain monetary amount. Again, we'll talk about 6 and 7 as we get into the judicial system and talk about the whole concept of trial by jury kind of thing. All right, so these 6 and 7 are pretty tied into one another. All right, Eighth Amendment protects against excessive bail. Bail is money or property an accused gives to the court. And also protects against cruel and unusual punishment, which is kind of a vague kind of term that in many cases, particularly when it comes to kind of police brutality and such, the Eighth Amendment has been invoked, all right, in that sense. So, and again, your bail is supposed to be like 10% of your bond in many cases, right? That idea is that you're just not supposed to be kind of put. Some people are not given bail depending on the certain kind of crime. If the crime's so severe, all right. The kind of bail has to kind of certain kind of match up to the essentially the crime. Ninth Amendment. This is 9th and 10th are kind of these ones that are like, well, we're not totally sure, we haven't covered everything probably. Let's just like kind of create these vague amendments to kind of have almost like catch-alls. All right, so rights not specifically listed in the Constitution are given to the people. All right, and this is kind of allowing for, as kind of time changes a little bit, to allow for the Constitution to kind of change with that. All right, like I said, the founding fathers aren't going to anticipate the internet, right? And so they're not going to anticipate kind of air travel and such. So there's certain things that are kind of put into the Constitution that will allow for the Constitution to change with time. All right, and the 10th one is basically extended to the states. All right, although they include people in there as well. The 9th and 10th Amendments are often viewed as something that is essentially kind of tie up the Bill of Rights here. All right, anything like I said not covered within the kind of specifics of like a trial by jury or a legal search and seizure and stuff like that are kind of put in within the 9th and 10th Amendments. All right. So on Thursday, we're going to knock out the other. You guys remember how many amendments are in the Constitution? 27. So we're going to try to knock out 11 through 27. I like them apples. All right.